Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You are tuned in to Getting Started with Your Sony Camera, part 3 of 3, hosted by Sony. For that, I'd like to welcome the man that we just put to the test in the green room, and he passed with flying colors, Tony Gale. Tony, what's going on?
Not much. How are you?
Doing wonderful. It's always great to have you on. We did, as I was saying, put Tony to the test before we went live today. Danny tried to stump him with some Sony tech questions, and without even blinking, everything solved like a glove. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tony to finish out this series and hopefully answer your questions. So if you guys do have any of them, get them into the comment section. If you're joining us from YouTube, drop them in the comment section. If you don't know about our YouTube, you should by now. Head over to YouTube and just look up B&H Event Space, and you can find this and all of our other live and recorded content there. Tony, take it away. I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And in addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, I'm also a BenQ ambassador, Manfrotto ambassador, and X-Ray Colorado. As Derek said, this is part 3 of 3. Before we went live, I was talking with everybody about it and said, it could almost be like an 8-part series, except that I don't think anybody wants to watch an 8-part series. But there's so much that these cameras can do, and we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. I'm a commercial photographer based here in New York City, primarily people and portraits. And I often say that we are in an exciting time to be photographers. I say that because, sort of apropos of today's topic, what we can do with cameras now is absolutely incredible. The technology that is available to us makes some pictures that just weren't possible in the past, and other pictures that would have been very, 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 very difficult, much, much easier to do. It's absolutely incredible. Coming up in a couple of weeks, we have 10 photos, 10 stories. We have a 5-part intro to lighting with natural light, constant light, speed light, strobes, and mixed lighting. Lighting, too, is a topic that you could have 3 times as much, 10 times as much, but I don't know if anybody wants to watch a 15-part series on lighting, so we're going to limit it to 5. I often mention Sony's Alpha Universe if you are just interested in Sony cameras or photography in general. Lots of great information and great inspiration there, alphauniverse.com. All right, there's already a question, which I will answer right after I do the finish with the intro stuff. Whoops, excuse me, I just hit the wrong thing. So alphauniverse.com, great resource just to learn about photography, be inspired. There's also the Alpha Universe forums if you have questions or just want to share your work, anything like that. It's available through alphauniverse.com. They're free and friendly. There's the Alpha Female Plus Facebook group. You don't have to identify as female to be a member. And every week they do a micro grant of $500 that you can win by just uploading a picture based on a certain topic that they announce every week. You also don't have to identify as female to win. All of that's at Sony Alpha Female on Facebook. And Sony has Sony Imaging Pro support. Sony Imaging Pro support, it's $100 a year. You do have to be at least somewhat pro. You don't have to be full-time pro, but you have to make some money with photography and have a certain amount of gear, but it gets you a discount on repairs. It gets you expedited repairs. It gets you loaners if your repairs are delayed. It gets you a couple of cleaning checks, 3 cleaning checks per year, which can be up to 2 products, which also includes shipping both ways. It's a great, great program for $100 a year. If you shoot at all professionally, I recommend it. Also, Sony Alpha 9 III, which we've talked about with the last 2 sessions of this, and we'll talk a little bit about today, is finally out and shipping. I got mine. It's very exciting. Absolutely incredible camera. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Also, the Sony 300 GM2, you'll notice that it's past Friday, February 23rd, is also available. Absolutely fantastic lens. Like anything, is it the right lens for everybody? Maybe it's right for you, maybe it's not, but it is awesome. And they just announced the new 24-50 Sony 2.8G lens, which is part of their compact series. It's designed for cameras like the Alpha 7C, Alpha 7C2, Alpha 7CR. So it's a very small prime So it doesn't take up a lot of space. It doesn't weigh a lot. I use my Alpha 7 CR as a walking around camera when I'm traveling. Absolutely cool. All right, getting started with your Sony Alpha camera, part 3 of 3. Now, Texas Pelican on YouTube asked, in short, what are the primary differences between the Sony Alpha series, e.g. the 9 and the R series? I think we might have talked about this in the first one, but maybe we didn't. It's a little bit of a big topic, but you have the numbers that start with 6, Alpha 6400, Alpha 6600, Alpha 6700. Those are APS-C cameras, so they're smaller sensor cameras. Then you have the Alpha 7 series. You have the 7, currently the Alpha 7 IV. You have the Alpha 7R5, and you have the Alpha 7S3. 7 IV is just your jack of all trades, good camera, does a little bit of everything. Alpha 7R5 is higher resolution. The R stands for resolution. It's 61 megapixels. The Alpha 7S3 stands for sensitivity. Most people typically use it as a video first camera. Things like the FX3 is basically the same as the Alpha 7S3, just with a few other things. So the 7 series is the main Pro series. Then you have the Alpha 9 series, which is aimed a lot at photojournalists, people who need speed. The Alpha 9, the first one, was the first camera that Sony put out that did 20 frames a second. It has a built-in Ethernet. A lot of photojournalists use it. A lot of people that shoot sports. A lot of people that shoot birds. And then you have the Alpha 1, which is the flagship camera that can do 30 frames a second, sync speed of 400, 50 megapixels. You also now have the Alpha 9 III, which can do 120 frames a second. It's 24 megapixels and has a global shutter, so it can sync at any speed. But that's sort of the differences between them. I hope that's helpful. Texas Pelican, I hope that answered your question. All right, getting started with your Sony Alpha camera, part 3. As I mentioned in the other 2 parts of these, there have been a lot of Sony Alpha cameras. You know, these are all the A-mount ones that I'm aware of. My first Sony camera was the A850, Alpha 850. Alpha 900 was a great camera. 99, 77, great cameras. Then you've got the mirrorless cameras, the E-mount stuff, tons and tons and tons. So plus the RX cameras. So for the most part, we're focusing on what is currently available, the current cameras. However, some of what we talk about will apply to past cameras, and some of the features we're going to talk about started with a specific camera and happen going forward. So what we talk about may be in your camera, it may not be in your camera. I can't speak to that without knowing your camera specifically, but we're going to talk about a bunch of cool features that Sony does in this part 3. And if it's a feature you really love and your camera doesn't do it, well, maybe when you get the next camera. All right, we're going to start with firmware updates. So one of the things you might consider anytime you buy a new camera is making sure the firmware is current, because the firmware updates either add more features or add stability. Sometimes there's bug fixes. It just depends on the camera, but it's worth checking your firmware. I'm not going to get into how to update the firmware on most of the cameras because it varies a lot. If you're on a PC, it's very, very straightforward. If you're on a Mac, it depends on your Mac operating system. It may or may not be straightforward. Because the Mac OS, every time it updates, they do a lot of stuff. It gets more complicated on a Mac. The newest Sony cameras, the firmware updates can be done via card. So you just download the file, put it on a SD card or a Top-Hat Flash Express Type A card, depending on the camera, put it in your camera and load the firmware from that. If you have that, then obviously if you have a Mac or a PC, it doesn't matter. But depending on your camera, it can make a difference how the firmware is done. I'm sorry, depending on your camera and on your computer. So what I recommend for everyone is take a look at Brian Smith. He's another Sony artisan, excellent photographer, one of the first Sony artisans, Pulitzer Prize winner, and a super nice guy. He has a blog post that he updates, the Bulletproof Guide to Sony Camera Firmware Updates. I would look up that if you're having any issues at all with firmware, because he walks through what to do if you're on this Mac OS, what to do with that. he walks through and makes it very, very easy. It's on his blog, just Bulletproof Guide to Sony Firmware Updates. So you've got camera firmware. You just do a search, firmware in your camera, download the file. Lenses might have firmware. For example, I just updated the firmware on my 7200 GM2 because they updated the firmware to make it work better with the Alpha 9.3 at 120 frames a second. So there are things like that where a new feature is added to a camera. Some lenses will be able to support that, some won't. Some Sony lenses just aren't fast enough to track at 120 frames a second. Depends on what kind of focus motors it has. The newest ones with the newest G Masters with the linear focusing motors should be able to keep up. But check that and upload that firmware. Typically with lens firmware, you put a lens on the camera, plug the camera into your computer, and update the firmware that way because there isn't a way to plug the camera or the lens in directly. And then your flash may also have a firmware update. So I just updated the firmware on my HVL F60 RM2 and HVL F46 RM because they added support to make it work better with the global shutter on the Alpha 9.3. With those, they do have a USB port that you plug directly into the computer. If you have a much older flash, like the Sony HVL F60R, not the RM, I'm sorry, the HVL F60M, not the RM, it wasn't user updatable with firmware, but the current stuff, the newest stuff is. All right. So check your firmware. Let's talk about focus bracketing. So focus bracketing is primarily used if you want to do focus stacking. The first camera, I believe, and this, when I talk about specific cameras and when things came out, this is where I could be not quite right sometimes. I believe the first Sony Alpha camera to have focus bracketing was the Alpha 7R5. So to get to that, the red camera, number 5, bracket settings, bracket type, focus. And you can go in there and change the step width, which is how much of a change it makes in focus every time it takes a picture. So it can be 9, it can be 1. It says 4 is standard. 1 is a very, very tiny change in focus. 9 would be a very big change in focus. And you can tell it the number of shots to make. So if you're shooting, those classic macro shots of a bug super close, you probably want a very low number with a very tiny differences in focus because it's going to make a huge difference. If you're trying to get the foreground rock in focus as well as the mountain in the back, you might be able to get away with a larger number. And then the number of shots is just going to depend on what you need. I tend to err on the side of more rather than less. You can always not use them all. But if you take a bunch of pictures, but you didn't take enough, and then you're doing it later, it's a problem. And you do all this in software later. I use Photoshop, but there's a bunch of things that do it. I also typically turn self-timer on during bracket because I don't want that first shot to be impacted by me physically hitting the shutter. I just do 2 seconds. And then it starts taking pictures. So I did a shot as an example, 20 frames as you saw. It tells you where it's going, but it's quick because it's taking a picture. So that was 5 of 20. And to give you a sense of it, this is the first shot I took. I was at f22, so as much depth of field as possible on this lens. And you can see the rubber band ball in my office here that we've been building for like 7 years. You would think it would be bigger. It's sharp. The Alpha 1 in the back, out of focus. Even at f22, they're about a foot and a half between them. So what can you do? f22, it's not all in focus. I mean, there are some tricks like deep focusing. We're not going to get into that. So focus bracket. So on the left, I have the first frame of my 20 frame focus bracket. On the right, I have the 20th frame of the 20 frame focus bracket. And then there's 18 others in between. Like I said, I assemble it in Photoshop. There's a bunch of tutorials, but there's a lot of other software that does it too. And the people who are really, really, really into it tend to use specific software. I'm not that into it. Then you end up with this. It assembles it. You assemble it later. Everything is sharp. The rubber band is sharp. The camera is sharp. The whole table is sharp in between. So that's the focus bracket. Then we have pixel shift. Pixel shift is available on the R cameras, the Alpha 7 R cameras, starting with the R3, which had a 4-frame pixel shift. The 4 and the 5, and this, I think the C has it. The CR and the Alpha 1 all have a 4 or 16-shot pixel shift. And what pixel shift does is physically move the sensor either 4 times or 16 times. If you do 4, it debayers the image, so you get true color at each photo site. For those who are super nerdy, your digital camera has a Bayer array. So there's 2 green, a red, and a blue in squares. And the light that hits the green, it sees the green, the light sees the red, it sees the red, the red light, it sees the blue, it sees the blue. But the blue's photo site doesn't pick up the green or the red, etc. With pixel shift, because the sensor moves, it gets all the color at each photo site, so it's more accurate color. With the 16-shot, it both does that, and you get 4 times the resolution. So here's a nice picture of downtown Manhattan. It's a pixel shift. You go into pixel shift, turn it on. The older menu, it's here. The newer menu, it's here. You tell it on. You can set it to 4 shots or 16 shots. You can set the interval between the shots. So it can be 1 second. It can be shortest where it does it automatically. It can be a longer interval. I usually do shortest unless there's a compelling reason not to. One of the reasons not to might be that sometimes I intentionally add a movement. But I'll show you what that looks like. Here's 16 shots shortest. So here is a 16-shot pixel shift I did in Grand Teton National Park a couple of years ago with the Alpha 7R4. So you can see, looks good. You're looking on a computer screen, so you can't really tell how sharp it is. But to give you a sense, the bigger picture, which is a pixel shift, the 16-shot, 19,008 pixels by 12,672 pixels. It's 4 times the size of a single shot, which is 9,504 pixels by 6,336 pixels. One important thing when it does this pixel shift bracket, each of those individual frames is usable on its own in case something goes wrong. You don't not have a picture. It's all done in post, which I'll show you. And to give you a sense of the detail, here's the bike storage in our condo building in Brooklyn. Very exciting. So if you look at that yellow lock, just to the right of it, you can see the air nozzle for the tire. That's how close you can get. Super clean, super sharp. Pixel shift is amazing. And then, if you want to, you can do silly things like this. I like to play around with it and do the things you're not supposed to, like self-portrait that's multiple exposures, because I moved as the camera was shooting. Moving the camera as it's shooting. A bunch of people moving and the camera's moving. And then to do pixel shift, you need to use the Imaging Edge desktop software. In the past, there was third-party software that also did it. I don't remember what it was called, but I also found it didn't work very well. It may work great now, I can't say. So you go into Imaging Edge desktop, which is free. You can select all of the pictures that are pixel shift. It will know, so if you just select everything, it's just going to ignore the things that aren't pixel shift. And if you did 10 of them, you can select all 160 images, and it will just build those individual pixel shifts because it knows this was frame 1 of 16, 2 of 16, 3 of 16. So you go in, you right-click. You tell it you want to do a pixel shift. You can tell it if you want it to save it as an ARQ, which is a RAW format, or open it or as a JPEG, or as a TIFF rather. I usually do TIFFs. It builds it, and then you're done. It assembles it, and you're done. It saves it. It's awesome. All right, another cool feature, bright monitoring. So bright monitoring is useful, especially if you're doing astro or really dark night photographs. Bright monitoring is a feature that makes the screen even brighter than the what you see is what you get, where you change the exposure and it shows you. So here's a picture. Here's live view setting effect off. So this exposure, one of the challenges with live view setting effect is if your exposure is too dark for the ambient conditions, you're not going to see anything, right? 1/80th of a second, f7.1, ISO 100. Turn live view setting effect off. I can see the exposure. It's obviously going to be too dark. With bright monitoring, you have to set a custom button to do it. So here I've set the custom 3 button to be bright monitoring. It will not work with continuous autofocus because it is a slow process. And then you turn it on and everything is still brighter. So you can see the top one, bright monitoring is on. The bottom one, live view setting effect is off. And you can see that the top one is brighter. So if you're in a situation that is very, 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 very dark, bright monitoring can be useful. If you need to focus on stars that you just can't see because everything's too dim, it's a very useful tool. You can also control your flash through the camera. If you're using a Sony flash, I do not know if it will work with dedicated flashes, that are dedicated for Sony cameras that are not Sony. I don't know if that works or not because I only use the Sony flashes. But in the menu, external flash set, you go in there, external flash firing set. You can control everything that you're doing on your flashes, the back of your flash panel, where you can change it from manual to TTL or whatever, high-speed sync on and off. If you're doing multiple flashes, wirelessly ratio control on and off. For this to work, there has to be a flash on your camera or the flash radio commander on your camera. It's not going to magically work with a flash off camera if nothing is on your camera. But you can change the ratio control. You can change the individual power, group flashing, remote release, which involves a cable. You can use your flash to trigger camera, TTL, manual, high-speed sync on and off. You can individually change the power of your flash, depending on the flash, from full power to 1/128th or to 1/256th. Ratio controls, 16 is brighter than 1 or off. All sorts of cool stuff. It makes it a lot easier because depending on how your camera is, you don't have to start monkeying with your flash if it's in an awkward position. You can just do it all through the viewfinder. If your camera is way up here and you're looking up, tilt your screen down, you can adjust everything without having to touch the flash that's on top. All right, live view setting effect we mentioned. Live view setting effect is a cool feature. It's on by default. I believe every mirrorless camera from everybody does it. It is showing you what the exposure looks like through your camera at whatever settings you have. So your ISO, your f-stop, and your shutter speed. Where this gets challenging is if you are using flash that is not a dedicated flash. So maybe you're using an older flash that's just using the single pin. Maybe using something like a pocket wizard on an external strobe with just a single pin. If you're using that, you put all that together, you set your exposure, you want to take a picture, everything looks dark because the camera doesn't know you're using a flash because it's that single pin. So there you want to turn live view setting effect off. I have a custom button to turn that on and off because I frequently use flashes, or not flashes, I frequently use strobes with triggers like pocket wizards that just aren't smart and don't communicate with the camera. So I turn it on and off. It used to be something that would come up all the time when somebody switched to Sony or to mirrorless. I would get calls, I would get emails from people. I'm in a studio, I need to use strobe, everything's dark, what do I do? Live view setting effect off. All right, let's talk about flash sync. There's a couple things hidden here that are very cool. Probably you're all familiar with flash sync. Flash sync is a sync speed that the camera can flash without going into high-speed sync. So it depends on the camera. For example, the Alpha 7 CR, because it's a compact camera, everything is smaller. Its sync speed, because of its shutter, is 1/160th. So if you set your shutter speed to faster than 1/160th, you'll either have to move into high-speed sync, or you'll start seeing the shutter in your frame with something like the Alpha 7 CR. Most Sony Alpha cameras are 1/250th. The Alpha 1 is 1/400th, 1/500th in APS-C. What's totally game changing now is the Alpha 9 III that just came out. And this is part of the reason I bought one. We'll do 1/80,000th of a second. So what that means is that you can use a flash that is very low powered outside in the sun by just cranking up your shutter speed in a way that wasn't possible before. It's not the same as high-speed sync, even though I'm about to show you some high-speed sync as well as the global shutter. High-speed sync fires multiple times to get a higher shutter speed. With a global shutter, it doesn't need to fire multiple times. It just fires once because the entire thing is exposed. The reason that you have a sync speed is your shutter doesn't expose everything at the same time. The bottom curtain falls, the top curtain falls, exposes like that. The whole frame isn't exposed at once you go past your sync speed. With a global shutter, it's all exposed at once. So why would you want a global or a flash at all? Here's a lovely picture. Very exciting, best picture I've ever taken. 1/40th of a second, no flash. Everything's blurry. 40th of a second, adding a flash. So the flash will stop motion to a point, but because there's so much ambient, it froze my hand, but there's still all the blur because that moment that the hand was there, it flashed, it captured that, but all the blur is still around it. So you might want to increase your shutter speed. 80th of a second, 1/60th of a second, there's still some ghosting. 1/250th of a second, there's still ghosting. So flash outside or under a lot of ambient light might still have ghosting, even though the flash can freeze the motion. The shutter speed isn't fast enough for that. If it was darker, it's a non-issue. 1/400th with the Alpha 1, so it's getting better. The difference between 250 and 400 is dramatic. 800th, so now we're in high-speed sync territory, much sharper, right? 2500, I mean, I can't move my hand that fast. It's totally sharp. This is high-speed sync. However, going to high-speed sync, you lose power because the flash is firing multiple times. So 80th, 250th, 1/400th, 2500th. But with the Alpha 9 III, this is a photo I did last week, 1/10,000th of a second with the HVL f60 RM2 into an umbrella in Manhattan at f2.8. And this is playing around with the camera before it launched at 32,000th of a second, a self-portrait into the sun with the flash, the Sony HVL f60 RM2 at 8th power into an umbrella. So that global shutter for flash sync, absolutely incredible. Amazing. All right. Picture profiles. Just about every Sony camera is going to have that. So picture profiles are settings you can do. Primarily, people use them for video. If you're shooting RAW, it's not going to make a difference. To change the feel of your video files, your motion files. So this is the Alpha 7R4. They vary. What the numbers are and what different things are vary by camera. But you can see the contrast is changing. The saturation is changing as we look at different files. So Cine 2, S-Log 2. People like to use S-Log because it's flat, so you get more shadow and highlight detail. S-Log 3. Hybrid log gamut, which is what I mostly use, is HLG. So those picture profiles, you can play around with them, see what makes sense in your workflow. But if you're shooting video often, you're going to want to use a picture profile. And if you're wondering what you do with that flat file, if it's S-Log. So this is S-Log ungraded, so straight out of camera. And then in your editing software, you add a LUT, which is a lookup table. And your lookup table will make it look like that or whatever, depends on your lookup table. So it adds in all that saturation and contrast, but it can help keep the highlight detail in particular. So those are picture profiles. All right. Another cool feature with the newer cameras, wireless tethering. So Sony cameras have been able to tether with a cable forever. Wireless tethering uses Wi-Fi to tether to your computer without a cable. If you have a newer camera that does it, you go to PC remote function, PC remote on. You're going to go to your PC remote connect method, Wi-Fi access points. You're going to go connect without pairing. You want to disable that. You want it because you have to pair. You go to your Wi-Fi, you go to your access point set, you select your Wi-Fi network. If you shoot on location, as I do, I have a router. It doesn't connect to the internet, just a router that I bring with me so that I have something to connect to that the computer and the camera can connect to. The router doesn't need to be connected to the internet. It just needs to let the computer and the camera talk. So you connect, you go in, you click up there, remote shoots, and then any camera that's on your network, you click on it. If you don't see it, you refresh, double click on it, connect the camera, you pair. Once it's paired, which you have to tell the computer to, or the camera, and then there you are. You can shoot tethered remote wirelessly through Wi-Fi using Imaging Edge, which is free software. So if you're shooting on location a lot, your cables are getting in the way, you want to be able to move around, it's a very great feature. All right, we have clear image zoom. So clear image zoom is a digital zoom, but it's better than probably the digital zoom on your phone, for example. It only works in JPEG, not RAW. If you try and use it and you're in RAW, it will just tell you it doesn't work. Go in, you can go anywhere from, here's normal, all the way up to 2. This is the back of the screen, which is why it looks so pixelated. And there you are. So this is regular, this is clear image zoom. And in case you're curious what the difference is, the top is an image using clear image zoom. The bottom is an image just cropped. Everything's the same. It's just cropped to the same field of view of clear image zoom. And to be honest, I think the clear image zoom looks better than the crop. I don't know what magic mumbo jumbo they do in there. But something they do in the magic of the camera really makes clear image zoom better than just cropping. However, the disadvantage would be if you use clear image zoom, you can't uncrop. So if you know you need it, it makes sense, as long as you don't need the raw file. If you don't know that you need it, if it's a possibility, then I wouldn't use it, but it is a cool feature. For example, if you're photographing birds, you want to get closer to the bird, right? But at least when I photograph birds, because I'm not that great at it, I want a wide enough field of view that as I'm moving the camera around, the bird is still in the frame. If I'm too tight on the bird, they're out of frame. It's easy for them to get out of frame, and then I miss the shot. So I would be more likely, under those circumstances, to crop later. But maybe you're photographing a flower you just can't get close enough to, or a building or a landscape, and you need that zoom and nothing's moving, then it could be a great feature. We also have focus peaking. People primarily use this in video, but you can use it in stills. Focus peaking is a feature where the camera tells you what things are in focus in your frame. So here, with the rubber band ball, the places in red are where the camera believes it's in focus. You can change that to be different colors depending on the camera: red, white, yellow, and blue, I believe, with the newest ones. So peaking display, yep, red, yellow, blue, and white. Peaking display, and you set the peaking display on. You set the peaking level so you can tell it to be more or less sensitive, and then the peaking color. Then we have zebras, also something primarily used in video. Zebras are set to a specific exposure value, and so you can use it to make sure that you don't lose your highlights, or if you have like a gray card, for example, if you know what the tonal value of that gray card is numerically, you can put that in the frame, adjust your exposure till you get the zebras on your gray card, and you know that you have the right exposure. If you're shooting stills with RAW, it's much less of an issue. If you're shooting video, it can be a very big issue. So zebras are very cool. Zebra display, turn it on. You can set the zebra level 70, 75, 85, 90. I usually set it high, and there's, depending on how you want to shoot, there's different suggestions by various people who know a lot about what to do. But I usually want it so that I know what my highlights are. So I set it high so I know that my highlights don't blow out. There's also a screen reader on the newer cameras. So if visually it's hard for you to look at the camera, you can turn the screen reader on and it will audibly tell you when you change a setting what it is, when you're going through the menu, what it is. So it's speed and volume. Touch operation. So touch operation is something I usually turn off because my face touches the screen and then it messes it up. I think we've all had those situations where holding the camera up to our eye, we take a picture, focus point has moved because our cheek hit the screen. But you can turn that on and off. You've got the touch panel and the touch pad, depending on the camera. So you've got the screen and then there's a little joystick pad, depending on your camera. You can change the sensitivity from sensitive or standard. You can tell it to be the panel, the pad, or both. And this is where it gets useful. If you're using the screen as a touch area, you can tell it that you want the whole screen to be live or just a piece of it. And so it can get useful if you're constantly, you want that touch screen on, but you're constantly touching it. If you do, say, the upper right, you can put your thumb in there to move your focus point around without your cheek hitting the whole screen and messing it up. So you can change what area functions, and that can be very cool. We have memory recall. So you can go in, set a bunch of different settings, whatever you want them to be. There's a ton of them. I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a lot. You register it. So then, depending on your camera, if you got 1, 2, or 3, or the MR setting on the dial, once you change to 1 or 2 or 3, you can see on the top here, it's 1, 2, 3, M1, M2, M3, M4. The 1, 2, 3 are on the dial, depending on the camera. The M1, the M2, M3, M4. You have to load, but you can set all the settings. You want it to be on ISO 640, this shutter speed, this aperture, this white balance, in RAW, doing all this focus area, this focus mode. Set it to 1. All of that goes into play. Sometimes if you're shooting both video and stills a lot, you might have a setting for video and a video setting for stills because there's a lot of things you might change in between them. So you just go to 1 and 2. Maybe 1 is stills, 2 is video. Go back and forth. You don't have to change every little thing and remember that you changed every little thing. You also may be able to change the display quality of your viewfinder. So it's probably standard by default. You can change it to high if you like. It will probably use more battery if it's on high. And to be honest, I just leave it on standard most of the time because the refresh rate is a little faster. Because it's not that important to me that the viewfinder be that high, super high resolution. But for some people it is. And like anything else, just because I don't use it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, and vice versa. We all have things that work for us and things that don't. And using standard isn't the right answer. Using high isn't the right answer. Using what works for you is the right answer. You also, on the newer cameras, you can save and load settings. So if you have, say, 3 Alpha 1s or 3 Alpha 7 R5s, and you have a bunch of settings that you set on the first camera, you can load, you can save and then load those settings onto a card, save those settings to a card, put that card in the second camera, load those settings, put that camera in the third, put that card in the third camera, load those settings. Or maybe there's a camera that you don't own, but you rent a lot. You can save those settings to a card. Don't write that card over. When you rent that camera next time, load those settings again. So it's a way to shortcut going in and changing every little thing. All right. Then we have PreCapture on the Alpha 9 III. I know that Sony was not the first to do this, but the PreCapture is full RAW. You can do 120 frames a second. It is magic. and it is a great setting. So the Alpha 9 III has it PreCapture settings. PreCapture, you turn it on. You set how long you want the PreCapture to be. So the longest is 1 second. The shortest is, I believe, 0.005 seconds, which, to be honest, I don't know what the use case for that is because it's so short. Shutter half press or AF assign button. So if you have the AF button set to something other than shutter, or both valid. And what that does is whichever button you've set it to, as long as you have that pressed or half pressed, if it's the shutter, it's constantly shooting, but not saving. So I was doing this at 120 frames a second, just waiting for this bird to move because, as I mentioned, I'm not that great of a bird photographer. And one of the things you always try and get is the bird taking off, right? But most of the time, this is what I get when the bird's taking off. So here's the bird, waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting. It goes, I hit the shutter. Well, I've got the tail of the bird, but that's not a useful picture. So either I could shot wider, so I've got less resolution because I'm shooting wider, or with PreCapture, I had 120 frames a second, and I've got, I'm not showing you all of them because you don't want to see them, but we've got the bird as its feet are still on the branch, but it's just about to take off on the left. We've got it taking off on the right. We're capturing that moment that there is zero chance I could capture without that PreCapture. There are people who can. I am not one of those people. All right. We covered a bunch of stuff. Let's see if there are more questions.
Sorry, Tony. I'm unmuting all 5 of my different settings here.
I forgive you. What we need is a code. You know what I should do next time is tell you what the last thing is that I'm going to do before we get to questions. Because every time you're like, oh, surprise, it's question time.
Surprise! It's like I don't know it's coming, and I know it's coming. But...
So I should just tell you the last thing before I go to questions is, and then you would be ready.
Then I just have like a little clue. Well, see, my thing is always this. Sometimes I turn off. I mute on Zoom. I mute on the mixer. It never fails when I'm muted on both. I start talking and I realize that I didn't unmute the other one. So it's a me problem. It's
well, last time, I hit the mute button on my headset as I leaned over to grab my water. So I think we're not alone.
It happens. It happens. What's the biggest thing that menu wise that people get caught up on with the Sony menus?
Well, see, it's tricky because the different menus have changed. I mean, the classic thing is that people think the menus are complicated. I firmly believe that any camera that's what you're used to, that menu makes sense, and every other camera is complicated. When I'm like doing a photo walk and somebody asks for help with their camera, if it's not a Sony, I have a hard time figuring out where things are in that menu. It doesn't matter what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what people forget is that there's a ton of features, as we just covered, that we went through a whole bunch of stuff. So the menu could be simpler if it did less things. And of course, there's always the person that's like, well, I don't need my camera to do these 10 things, so they shouldn't be there. But somebody else does want those 10 things, and they don't want 10 things you do. And it doesn't make any sense to make 50 different variants of a camera that each focus on a specific thing.
You have to have everything for the people that want it.
Yeah. And as we've covered in the past, last time with customization, you really don't have to dig deep in that menu hardly ever once you get your camera dialed in. Whatever it is that you want, you can have the function menus or a custom button or my menu. You don't have to dig deep. It's once you set it up, it's there and it's easy.
Yeah, that's coming from somebody who's not a native Sony photographer. I will say you're totally right. And on the times that you do explore in the menu, it's a lot of stuff that's like, oh, that's probably really cool, or I can see where this would work. I don't need it, but it's cool to know that it's there. And there's options in there that I probably would never need or use in my personal workflow, but I can see them being a huge help in other workflows.
All right, there's a few questions. One I missed earlier. So Barbara from Vimeo, when focus bracketing on the Alpha 7R5 to take pictures of a flower that has portions at different heights and different distances from the camera, where do you place the initial focus point, and how many pictures do you program the camera to take? That's a good point. I didn't cover that. You can tell it to either start at the you can tell it to start at the nearest focus point, or basically you set the focus. You tell it focus here, and then you can tell it this is the first one and everything else is further away. So to answer that, I would focus on the closest point on whatever it is that you want sharp, or if you're worried, even a little forward to that. Focus on the closest point, and then it will, as long as you don't change that setting, it will then focus a little deeper each time. So close, slightly less close, slightly less close, slightly less close, slightly less close, further, 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 further. As for how many pictures do you program the camera to take, it's going to depend on what you're photographing. I would always say more is better than less. Like if you're at it, I mean, it goes fast. When that 20 frame bracket I did as an example here, that took like 20 seconds. Like it goes fast, especially if you're outside and there's a lot of light. It just goes bam, 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 bam. So even if you do 50 or 100 or whatever, if it bogs down your software, you can take out some of those, but I would try more rather than less. All right, then Texas Pelican, PreCapture. You focus on the bird and the camera knows to just work on the bird. It ignores everything else. So I focused on the bird, and because I had tracking on, it just follows that bird and ignores everything else. If you have tracking on, it doesn't magically know, well, it does magically know that there's a bird because you have a bird identification on. So, but it doesn't know which bird until I tell it. It doesn't start recording until I fully press the shutter though. So the shutter's half pressed. I'm waiting for something to happen. I saw the bird move as I showed. By the time I had registered it that it had moved, it was basically out of frame, but I hit the shutter. It recorded the 3/4 of a second before the 0.7 seconds before I hit the shutter. And then after I hit the shutter until it let go or until the buffer fills. So that's how that works. And then Nicola from Drawn of Guthrie from Vimeo, best way to save only one image from a PreCapture burst on the Alpha 9.3. To be honest, I wouldn't figure it out until you download the card. I mean, you can always, there is a setting which we didn't cover. You can protect files in your camera. So you can protect the one that you want. And if that's all you photographed, you can just wipe out everything else on the card. But if you, so maybe you've been doing PreCapture all day and you've got 10 hero frames and 2,000 frames you don't like. If you're 100% sure and you have those 10 frames protected, which you can do use with a star rating, you could then delete everything else. But first test that, make sure 100% that it's working the way you expect it to before you ever do anything. Because the last thing you want to do is think things are protected and they're not, and you delete stuff and then it's gone. I mean, you can always run card recovery software as long as you didn't overwrite the file, but that's a different thing. And to be honest, I would just wait to decide that one frame until you download the card.
Yeah, that's a panic attack. I'm getting anxiety over here thinking about deleting. Everything looks great on the LCD.
Or it doesn't, or you think you didn't get it.
Yeah.
I've thought it is not uncommon for the picture I think is the winner when I'm looking at the back of the camera to be not the best picture, and something else I didn't notice is.
Yeah. Yeah. Or I look quick and something didn't buffer and completely load and it looks soft and you you discredit it and then you get it up on your computer and you're like, oh. It's like the old adage of the computer processor. Would you rather process your images with a processor this big or one the size of a computer? It's more computing power. You could see it, larger screen. So,
all right. So hopefully those answer those questions.
Perfect. Well, that looks like we got all the questions covered, Tony. As we all know, this will not be your last hurrah here. So if anybody does have any questions, Tony's a regular here, so you're bound to see more of him. We have all of his
weeks.
in a couple weeks. We got all your contact information right there. So if anybody wants to track you down, has a burning question, can always reach out to Tony or wait to see him on another edition of the event space. So Tony,
If you do reach out, sorry to interrupt, and I don't get back to you, just reach out again, because I might not have seen it, or I was just busy and distracted and I forgot to get back to you.
Tony's out there working, creating the content that we all learn from. So busy guy. Sometimes. Well, we thank you for always making time in your day to share your expertise with us and all of our viewer base. Always good having you on, Tony. A huge thank you, of course, to Sony for supporting this kind of content that we do put out for all of you free. So keep learning here with the B&H Event Space. As I said earlier, you can find us on YouTube, where this and all of our other recorded content lives. Just look up B&H Event Space on YouTube. That is it. That's all we have in the books for today. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tony.